tiny bit of effervescence.
A little bit of effervescence, yeah. All right, howdy. So we are here from Instagram, the Scicommunity, over onto Nexus, which is the platform for their YouTube and for all videos. So we're going to be talking about external factors on fermentation today. And the first question we have to ask, hands down, is what is fermentation? Brian, can you answer that?
So in the case of wine, fermentation is essentially the process of converting sugar to alcohol and CO2. At least for primary fermentation. And then you have secondary fermentation in some white wines and almost all reds, converting malic acid into lactic acid. So basically,
can you explain what that fermentation is called?
That is malolactic fermentation?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Basically, it's what makes astringent malic acid into nice little buttery, nice mouthfeel lactic acid.
Yeah, so there are multiple kinds of fermentations that can go on in a primary fermentation of a wine. The one that we classically think of is that sugar into alcohol fermentation, but there is also, unless you stop it in some way, shape, or form, a malolactic fermentation, and that can be inoculated or it can be natively done. So today we're going to be talking about purely inoculated fermentations. And so what that means is we're adding yeast to it. And the reason we're going to be talking about inoculated fermentations today is because they have more consistency and they're easier to talk about when you're comparing like apples to oranges. It's very hard to talk about things that are consistent in a fermentation that is wild yeast fermentation. And so on that note, Brian, can you ask you can ask any questions. Can you please comment on if I were to be doing a classic fermentation with inoculated yeast, how would that differ between a classic red varietal and a classic white varietal? And what would that process look like?
So the first step would be rehydrating yeast, but that yeast would be a commercial yeast purchased from a store supplier that you picked just to make a certain style of wine. So yeah, white wine yeast different from red wine yeast, depending on what characteristics you would like to get out of the ferment.
Why are they different?
Because basically you do, like at the end of the day, you want different flavor profiles, aromas coming out. And also in terms of the speed of the ferment, you want a slow ferment at a cooler temperature for white wines versus a higher temp, quicker ferment on reds. But that is also depending on style and the winemaker. Right.
So I guess on that note, I'm actually going to go off topic a little bit here, but so why might a winemaker choose to ferment things at different temperatures, like you just mentioned?
So people have different philosophies in terms of extraction. So for whites, at least, you do ferment between 50, 60, maybe 65 degrees. You have more delicate juice.
And this is Fahrenheit, correct?
That's correct.
Remember, we have we're not just in the US, not just in California.
At cooler temperatures, and white ferments can last, usually like 3 weeks, at least what I've experienced, maybe even a month. And usually more reductive than with red wines. Red wines, depending on the temperature, it can go anywhere from 5 to 7 days up to about 2 weeks, I would say.
Okay.
And you can also stretch that out at a cooler temperature up to maybe 18 to 20 days.
What is the benefit of a winemaker if they, or not, maybe benefit's the wrong word, but why, again, might a winemaker choose to go cooler? Choose, besides just the word extraction, what does that really mean? What are we extracting?
So color, tannin, just overall phenolics in general from the skins, and also to a certain extent the seeds for red wines especially. So at a cooler temperature, you'll get a longer maceration period, then greater extraction. However, you can achieve some of the same goals with a shorter, higher temperature fermentation, and then you can also lose some of the aromas and flavors with the high temp, quicker fermentation as well.
Yeah, so I'd actually like to talk a little bit about that and kind of extend on that idea. So when he's talking about pigments that we're extracting, and he's using words like anthocyanins and phenolics and tannins, those are all very specific chemical components of the grape berry itself, and also sometimes the stem and the seed. And so if Brian is saying a word like phenolics, he means anything that has a phenol group on it, which is a benzene ring with a hydroxyl group off of it. Anthocyanins as a class of compounds are three ring membered compounds, and they're in a monomeric state, and they contribute color to a wine typically. And then you have a group of things that you can extract in these processes, also called flavonoids or flavanols. And they are the building blocks of tannins. So flavanols can polymerize into a group of compounds called tannins. And tannins can be anywhere from 3 to 5 chain monomer, they become polymers at that point, but 3 to 5 monomers to make a polymer in the seed, and anywhere from like 30 to 40 if they're in the skin.
And then the longer the better, or in terms of producing like a smoother, kind of better tannin structure as well.
Yes. So when you think about tannin evolution, which again are long chain polyphenols, that changes as a function of time as well. And so if you have, as a winemaker, something coming in that maybe you want to get more phenolic composition of, you might change your fermentation.
Exactly.
Correct? So let's say you are my consulting winemaker, Brian, and I come to you and I say, I have a Pinot Noir and I am going to do an inoculated yeast fermentation and I want to extract the bejesus out of that tannin.
Yes.
How might I go about doing that?
I'd say a week-long cold soak with extended pump overs. Then
what do those words mean?
All right. So a cold soak is basically you have the fruit picked, then you can put it through a crusher or you do carbonic maceration, which is,
what does that word mean?
You leave whole berries and you do not crush it at all. You extract less tannins that way. Less astringency, less bitterness. Yeah, that's another subject.
Yeah.
If you want to extract the crap out of it, you would put it through the crusher and then basically have it in whatever your vessel is. And if you have temperature control, keep the temperature as low as you can. Then basically do pump overs where you take juice from the bottom of the vessel and pump it over the top and keep layers of dry ice. Well, when you crush it, layer it as you go. And then when you're doing pump overs, put a nice couple scoops of dry ice over the top to protect the juice. And then also you get benefits from also freezing the grape skins. It ends up in higher extraction rates as well.
Interesting. Okay. So if you were to describe to somebody who's never been a part of the winemaking process, what does the process of a primary fermentation look like?
So the process of primary fermentation,
and please feel free to ask any questions.
So once
guys.
you inoculate, I take
Please.
it.
Yes. So
once you inoculate, you'll probably have a good 24, 48 hour span, maybe 72 hours for the yeast to really kick in and get going. And then from there, it's there's essentially almost kind of like a bell curve in terms of fermentation rate, in terms of converting the sugar into alcohol. So it starts off slowly, then hits an exponential rate. I guess it's not a bell curve, but
it's a bell curve, but it's really not a bell curve.
It's a curve, I will say that. You may be going from 1 to 2 bricks fermenting per day up to like 4, 5, maybe even 6, depending on how hot it is. And then once you get down to about 4 or 5 bricks, it slows down, and then you can spend the last couple days, or maybe even a week, getting from about 4 bricks down to negative bricks, and that would be dry.
So can you explain why the end of the fermentation takes longer than the peak and the beginning of the fermentation?
So basically at that point, yeast has kind of eaten up all the nutrients and possibly died off if it got up to higher temperatures, because once you're 90, 95 and above, they start dying off. So at that point, you're getting to a point where there's less sugar, probably less yeast-soluble nitrogen as well, and they're just trying to get it dry, but it just takes longer because there's less yeast, and it's harder for them to get to the end.
So it's a function then of both like nutrient deficit and availability of yeast that are still alive to keep the fermentation going, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So we already touched a little bit on the time frame for a typical inoculated yeast culture to go from juice to dry wines, which was 3 weeks?
Yeah, and at cellar temperature, yeah, I'd say it's safe bet. Yeah, 2 to 3 weeks.
Can you say what cellar temperature is?
70 to 75 degrees or 65 to 75 degrees. During harvest, I usually feel like it's warmer just because they do want it warmer for the fermentations.
Well, and you're also opening up the winery doors a lot more and all that stuff. Yeah. So what types of, this is like kind of the bulk of the talk. What types of vessels can you ferment in? Let's just start there and describe what those vessels look like for someone who hasn't seen those vessels.
So I would say most common would be stainless steel tanks.
Also, please ask a bunch of questions. Like I can see, if there's like space to ask questions here on the side, I would love to answer them.
So pretty much large cylindrical stainless steel tanks, and they may or may not have what you call jackets on them, which are essentially little dimpled jackets that contain glycol, which can be run through a glycol system that usually can cool it, but also now we have the option for glycol heaters, which can also warm up the ferments to get them kick-started and keep them going.
And how big are these stainless steel tanks? Or how big
they are? They're as small as a couple 100 gallons, or even a couple 100 liters, and then I would say even up to about, a million liters. I think is what I've seen.
1 million liters? Oh,
Treasury wine.
Hey, don't name drop, Home Slice. Don't name drop. Wow. 1 million liters in a tank. How big is that tank?
Enough for multiple catwalks and staircases. Oh God, I don't even know how many staircases going up that one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God, can you guys even imagine what 1 million liters of wine looks like?
And those size tanks are usually outside also, which can be very hot and not fun to carry if you're doing additions up the top of the tank, dropping it in.
Yay.
Yeah, or just climbing up in general.
Yeah. People forget that oftentimes when you work at a winery, you spend half of your job just climbing on stuff.
Yes.
Like you're pulling samples all day, climbing up barrels, and then throwing it down the drain.
Yeah, I did 20 kilometers, and I think it was about 40 flights of stairs, like on the Apple Health app one day last vintage.
Yeah.
Good times.
Super duper fun.
Yeah.
So that's stainless steel tank, and you can have those in a temperature controlled way where you have a jacket around them, or you can have them just as is. What is another type of vessel that you can ferment?
I was going to say you can also have them open top, which literally no top, where you just have a cap of grape skin, seeds, pumice, and I guess dry pumice in general.
Can you explain the word pumice, please?
Yes.
I'm going to call you out on all your jargon.
Thank you. So it's pretty much once you crush your fruit, it's just a mix of seeds, skins, grape stems. If you are doing whole cluster.
And what does whole cluster mean?
When you crush, or when you, I know, right? Basically, when you can crush fruit or press fruit and you leave the stems included into your ferment.
Whole cluster is a whole topic on its own.
Yeah. Which, yeah.
I learned about today.
Yes.
I'm really stoked to share you guys.
So yeah, open top or closed top tanks. Benefits of both. Open top, we're going to this a little bit later, more oxidative. Since you actually have exposure to oxygen, hopefully you'll have a little CO2 blanket on it that keeps it safe.
And that CO2 blanket is from yeast who are actively going through fermentation of sugar into alcohol. So one of those byproducts is CO2. And CO2 is heavier than oxygen. And as a consequence, it settles down lower than the oxygen does. And so it actually makes a little protective cap from an oxidative environment. So oftentimes when you hear people doing an open top or open vat fermentation, you're like, that sounds sketchy as hell because you're probably introducing a lot of oxygen to your fermentation. You're not, because CO2 is heavier than oxygen, and CO2 is a byproduct of fermentation.
Yes. So then,
I'm just here for the nerdy shit.
No, I appreciate. I forget that. Yeah, I'm glad to have you here to explain it. So the other option is closed top, which is what it sounds like, where you have a closed tank with a little manway door on top of the tank. Then in terms of other vessels, you have concrete, which is it's specialized concrete for these fermentation wine tanks.
Oh, I don't know that. How's the concrete different?
I actually don't know. Okay. But if you Google Vino Vessel, they're one of the makers. They go into it on their website a little bit.
Okay, cool.
They're out of Paso Robles, and they make great tanks.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah,
I should know that.
Nice little plug.
Yeah, right. I work with concrete tanks.
Yeah.
I should know this, but I just don't.
Sonoma Cast Stone.
I don't know. No, I don't know.
You have to know this thing. tanks?
I don't know. I don't know.
But yeah. Concrete.
Hair in my eyelash. I'm sorry. Keep talking.
They're always closed top, or usually closed top. However, you have the tank can have some oxygen because the concrete is usually a little bit porous. But
yeah,
overall,
and so how does the porosity of the tank affect the fermentation of the tank? We're talking about this a little bit later, but we'll just touch on it right now since you mentioned it. You dug yourself this hole.
I know. No, I'm aware. My experiences with concrete, even though the whole sales pitch is that, okay, it's a closed top tank, but you still have those little oxygen, tiny little bubbles from the pores in the tank. At the end of the day, I feel like they don't do that much.
We could be making enemies right now.
My personal opinion.
We could be making enemies right
now. But there are ways to add oxygen to the ferment, which we will go into later.
We will go to that later, yes. So what else can you ferment in? We have stainless steel tanks so far, and we have concrete tanks.
Next is amphora.
Amphora. I love amphora.
Mixed feelings here.
I should just leave.
Limited experience. Limited experience. But from my limited experience, I mean, I don't feel like going into it.
Let's describe what an amphora is.
Yeah. Pretty much a giant clay pot.
It looks like a giant clay pot. I can throw a picture of an amphora up on the Scicommunity story so you can see what it looks like.
But it's one of the most old school ways of fermenting back, Italy, Greece, even Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So similar idea in terms of concrete. They're smooth, but also at the same time a little bit porous. Say you can ferment them. I feel like right now it's more trendy to do some aging in them.
Exactly, yeah. We don't ferment an amphora, but you can.
I have.
You have? Okay.
Don't do reds. It's way too hard.
Did you just make yourself a giant mess?
It's digging out, so when you're done with the ferment, pump the juice out. You have to dig out the skins to put into the press. Amphora, they usually don't get that big, at least for the ones that are coming to California. So you have like 12-inch hole on the top, and you're trying to shovel grape seeds and skins out, and it's kind of difficult. However, it's super unique and great marketing tool and makes interesting wines.
It does make interesting wines, yeah.
Yeah.
What else can you ferment in?
Then you can also ferment in oak vessels, which can be essentially barrels that you pop the heads off, or more likely puncheons, which are essentially double the size of normal barrels. So they hold 500 liters, and they hold about a half ton of fruit when you do choose to ferment in them. And the beautiful thing is you can ferment in neutral puncheons or oak or new oak, or even once used, twice used, that kind of deal.
Yes.
And then on a larger scale, you have oak casts and foudres.
What are those?
Essentially, oak tanks. So
again, ask as many questions as you want, please. Like, no one's asked a question yet. Like, I'm asking all the questions.
So imagine a large oak tank vat. So it actually has like manways, valves, fittings, so like stainless steel built into it. So it's more like a normal kind of wine tank.
Okay.
They make great wines. They're
all reliables.
Yes, and with oak in general, you rarely get stuck fermentations because you have a constant flow of oxygen through the oak, which is very nice.
That is very nice.
And while it can also impart some nice oak flavors.
We can actually maybe I'll write this down. We can talk about stuck or stop fermentations.
Yeah, super
and what
fun.
they need. Super fun. Stuck ferments.
Yeah.
Yay. How you get a stuck ferment and what to do with a stuck ferment, because it's one of the most inconvenient things that you could possibly experience.
And it ruins someone's next 48 hours. Yeah.
It totally does.
We'll go into that later.
So do inoculated yeast exhibit a different fermentation rate in different vessels of equal volume? So for example, let's say I have, these numbers aren't accurate, that don't exist in the wine world necessarily. Well, they might, but let's say I have a 200-gallon barrel and I have a 200-gallon steel tank. Is the rate of fermentation or the characteristics of the fermentation going to differ between those two vessels, even though they're the same volume? So
the characteristics of the wine will differ based on the fact that it'll be like stainless versus oak. But in terms of what like the fermentation curve will be, may take a little bit longer for the native yeast to kind of get kickstarted. but once it hits the exponential phase, it'll at least be similar to the commercial inoculation vessel to a certain point. So once it, I guess the shortcomings of native yeast fermentations will be that they're usually a little more difficult to get to finish a fermentation and get the wine to be dry.
Right.
But not necessarily, but you don't really know what you're getting at the end of the day, which native yeast will take over. With a commercial yeast, a lot of them have been handpicked and bred, so they ferment dry pretty much no matter what.
So inoculated yeast, 200-gallon barrel, 200-gallon steel tank. They're going to finish fermentation at basically the same time, but exhibit different characteristics in between, or is that incorrect?
For the most part, that is correct.
Okay.
But it really depends on which native strain takes over.
So I don't want to sidetrack on strains too much. Strains are really fun, actually.
Yeah. Gives you a lot of creative control.
Yeah, we'll be talking later on the Evening of Enology series about yeast strains. I'm actually working on getting a yeast biologist on for the show, which should be super duper fun. Yeah. And we'll talk all about yeast because there's a bunch of different types of yeast. I think there's 8 Cerevisiae strains, right? Something like that, yeah. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae, genus and species, is the yeast strain that will take over the vast majority of fermentations, and should, if all goes well. But within that, you have like 8, 9, I don't know. I think 8 is the right number, substrains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and they all exhibit different characteristics, and they have different rates of fermentation as well. But that's neither here nor there for today because we're not talking about yeast today. So can we talk a little bit about the oxidative or reductive potential of a vessel? Because that's a pretty big deal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Stainless steel's on the most reductive side of things, if it's a closed top. If it's open top, things change a little bit. But basically, at the end of the day, you need oxygen for your ferment to go smoothly. So if you are using a closed tank, stainless steel vessel where very minimal air can get in, you need other tools, which can probably go into.
We can talk about it.
Okay,
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's get dirty. Let's get dirty.
So at this point, we have a thing called Venturi. So it's an air injector. So you can have a closed top stainless steel tank, and you can have something on the exterior of the tank as you're pumping into it that pulls air, or you can also use actually straight oxygen out of tanks that go into your ferment, which is nice. And then if you do have the ability to have like an open top fermenter, you can use a Lotus. Is there another word for that? That's the brand. Well,
just describe what it's like.
So
we try not to brand drop here.
Yes,
we try. I have to remind him sometimes.
Yes. So basically, so much of harvest work and managing ferments and the cap or doing punch downs or pump overs. When you're doing pump overs, you try to spray the entire cap to minimize degradation and essentially sketchy stuff growing on top of your ferment by constantly putting juice over it, and it protects it.
So if we're going to visually imagine what's going on right now, what Brian's describing is because remember, a lot of people haven't seen this. They don't even know what these words are. So you have a vessel. We're talking about steel right now, right? Stainless steel tanks. And it's X size, X volume, probably fairly big. Let's say it's as tall as me. I'm all of 5'4". So it's as tall as me. And on top of that, you have all the solids, more or less. You have what you described earlier, like the seeds, the skins, all that stuff. It's called the cap. So that, can you explain why the cap goes to the top of a fermentation tank, even though it's a solid and it should settle?
So at the end of the day, yes. So it ends up separating. So juice goes to the bottom, solids go to the top, mainly due to when the ferment starts, you have CO2 bubbling, pushes it up.
Exactly. So remember that fermentations create not only alcohol, which is why we drink wine with grape juice.
Yeah.
Cheers, homie.
Name dropping Kiss the Pito. Big fan.
Oh my God, you and the name dropping.
I know.
Ah.
I'm a loyal fan.
It is a really great Pinot, actually. Brian opened a 2010 Pinot from them. It's a small, no, not small. It's Sonoma County.
Yeah. Used to be small.
Used to be small. When you bought this bottle, it was small.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have alcohol that is a consequence of the fermentation. You also have CO2, which we mentioned earlier. And that CO2 bubbling up literally brings solids to the top. And what we don't want happening is those solids at the top getting all like gunked up and nasty and gross. And so we just hit it with some juice.
So, and you can do that by having a pump from the bottom connected, pumping wine from the bottom, and then you pump it over the top. And then the other way is the punch down, where you can manually do it, and you just have a giant tool that has like a large stainless steel.
It looks like if you just like slapped a steel plate on the bottom of a steel rod.
Yep. And you punch down and break the cap.
Yep. Over
really
and
fun.
Over and over again.
Yeah. 2 to 3 times a day too.
Yeah.
It's a nice workout.
Yeah. So stainless steel reductive, again,
Yes.
getting back, we diverged a little bit there. So stainless steel is reductive.
Yes.
What is that?
As long as it's closed off for the most part.
Right. What does that impart as far as a chemosensory perspective is concerned on a fermentation or fermenting juice?
Yes. Higher risk of sulfides. So basically, if you have less oxygen in your ferment, you produce H2S.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, sulfur could also be an episode all on its own. Sulfur and sulfur compounds are a huge deal in wine.
Yeah.
Huge deal.
Also,
So as a winemaker, if you understand that you can get sulfide production from a reductive environment in a fermentation, why might you still choose to go in a reductive vessel?
Greater control. So stainless is pretty much the main vessel with the best temperature control, I would say. So if you want to do cooler ferments, you want to do hotter ferments, usually you're going to go with stainless. And in terms of sanitation, easiest to get completely clean and sanitary. Oak is a lot more difficult and a lot more maintenance.
Yes.
Stainless is easier to maintain throughout the year and easier to turn over in between lots of grapes coming in.
So what is if we're on a spectrum of reductive to oxidative here, what's the next step in reductive for fermentation tanks or vessels? Sorry.
Concrete, but not by much.
Yeah.
Still pretty reductive. I've had some issues with that. It's fun stuff.
Neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And so on the spectrum then of steel to concrete, then what's the next step you might take?
Oak.
So
unless you can think of it. Oh, I guess you can also bring plastic bins into the picture.
You can. So yeah, you can just ferment in a bin,
Yes.
in a plastic vessel.
So it's a lot of small wineries that are producing hundreds, couple thousand, even up to 10,000, 20,000 cases. They'll use these things called macro bins, which are essentially 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet too, or 4 feet tall.
I think it's
And
yeah, I'm a little bit taller than it. It's like it's like 4 by 4 by like 4 or 5.
Yeah.
No, 4 by 5 by 4.
Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah.
But yeah, they hold a ton of fruit, so it's very convenient and they're stackable.
And when he says a ton, he means like a metric ton. He's not like they hold a ton of fruit. Like they hold an actual ton of fruit.
And
which is a pretty common metric in the wine industry because you harvest tons of fruit.
And yeah, pretty much the minimum to buy fruit will be a ton, pretty much always, if not multiple tons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But those are always going to be open top. You can get plastic lids for them, but they're by no means airtight.
So on the reductive,
I'd say then closer to oak. Next step, I would say those.
And would you put it closer to oak because it is leaky and it brings oxygen in?
And for the most part, yeah, it depends on what wine you're at. A lot of people just leave them open, maybe a screen on top. They use as an open top fermenter.
Yeah. And then oak.
And we have oak, which is...
Oak is probably the most oxidative vessel you can ferment in.
Yes. And you get nice interactions between the ferment and even neutral, you get a completely different ferment than any other kind of vessel. And then new oak, it's fantastic to ferment in, throw the head on, and then you press into it.
Yeah. Something interesting to think about, and I don't know, I'm kind of throwing you under the bus right now. We didn't talk about this, but we'll see if you can answer it. oxidative and reductive environments also create different zones for growth for microbiology, right?
Right.
Am I gonna into the territory you don't know that well?
Probably, but keep going.
So certain bacteria, in a fermentation you have yeast, and they're carrying out the important job of converting sugar into alcohol. But alongside that, like Brian mentioned earlier, you also have bacteria doing fermentation. So the biggest fermentation is malolactic fermentation. But you can also have fermentations that you don't want. Sometimes you can make too much acetic acid. Some compounds that are unfavorable for an environment. So are you able to, and you can totally say no. He's like, I don't know. Can you comment on how oxidative or reductive environments create different availabilities for different microbiome to grow? No. Okay, never mind. We'll talk about another podcast. Not today. So something that is kind of fun to think about is the fact that in microbiology as a whole, you have organisms that are aerobic or anaerobic. And if you have bacteria that thrive in an anaerobic environment, which some of those are in wine, you don't want to put it in a reductive vessel because you're going to get off-target effects where those bacteria are creating compounds that you don't want, because if you put it in anaerobic environments, which tend to be reductive as well, but not always, you might see a situation where your yeast might crap out, and those bacteria will take over and they'll start to overtake your fermentation. So we can talk about that on another episode, because microbiology of fermentation in itself is just like mind-blowing.
And my weakness.
And apparently Brian's weakness. So I just was an asshole.
One of my many weaknesses.
I was an asshole and I threw him under the bus. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're welcome.
This is my last time on the show.
This is what friends are for, throwing under the bus apparently. So let's talk about a stuck fermentation or a stopped fermentation, and what that word means, and how does it fix it?
So 2 likely causes. The ferment got too hot, so 95, 100, I've even seen like 105 degrees, kill the yeast before they can finish. Yeah, I know, right? And that was willingly put up to 100, then it just kept getting hotter.
Spicy.
But the more likely cause, because that's a very unique approach, not too many people do that, would be running out of essentially nitrogen or yeast nutrients.
Right.
What was the second part of that question? What do you deal with it?
Yeah, so when you have a stuck fermentation, it means that you run out of nutrients, nitrogen primarily.
So the ferment ends, you basically get a stuck level of sugar that has been converted to alcohol. So at that point, you need to at least say rescue. I say rescue. And the brand name.
You come out like a sailing ship and you just like rescue your poor wine that isn't fermenting.
There may not be a yeast called Rescue Special.
Really? Oh, that's so funny. I didn't
you didn't know that? Oh, I was just more joking because I was name dropping again.
Brian.
It's a great product, though.
So you've noticed that your wine is stuck, which we can measure. And this, I guess this is where I'm going to jump in for a hot second. And you know this answer as well. So I'm not jumping in because
Thanks for assuming I know it.
He doesn't know this. I'm jumping in because I want to. I don't know. Whatever. So there's a lot of things that you can track in a winery. And we track a lot of these things just by simple enzymatic reactions. And so the reaction of glucose to glucose 6-phosphate is very easy to monitor. And we use that to see how much sugar is left in our wine. And so if we are good little winemakers and good little enologists, what we'll do is during fermentations, we'll take samples periodically and we'll see if the grams per liter of sugar is changing. If you notice over a week or two that your grams per liter are not dropping, you're in a stuck ferment.
Week or two. That's
yeah. Well,
I usually go about 3 to 4 days. Maybe.
Yeah. So right.
Yeah.
And that's also an inoculated versus native
yeast
thing.
Good call.
Yeah.
Good call.
So I work at a winery that does yeast fermentations. So
and I'm all inoculated because
Yeah. Anyway, so you track that process via UV-Vis, and if you see that your numbers aren't dropping after a certain amount of time, you know you're in a stuck ferment. And at that point, what do you do? You look at your numbers and you say they're not dropping. They haven't dropped in X amount of days. I'm in a stuck ferment. I have to fix this now.
Basically, you start a new culture with commercially available or commercial yeast. Thank you, myself. Usually special strains that are formulated just to finish out stuck fermentations. What is the term? What's the French term for it? The special? No. Okay, never mind.
I don't speak French. But that's not a good example, though. It's like a lot of terms in wine that are all French. So
I know, for no reason.
Oh my gosh, you're fired.
Basically, you'll take a little bit of the juice from whatever wine that is stuck, then take it out, small scale, it can be buckets, separate tanks, whatever. Then you can add some yeast nutrients and some of this this special rescue yeast. Basically, ferment that to 0.
Yeah.
All right. And then you'll add that back into the tank, and hopefully it will finish out the fermentation.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Sometimes you may have to do that multiple times because I have in the past.
Oh,
but
no,
it's
really?
based. Yeah.
Oh.
But even to once
Sorry.
you're making your special yeast bucket ferment, that usually takes 24 hours, where you're monitoring the bricks and temperature every 30 minutes to an hour, so it can really ruin a night or a weekend. I've known my poor boss literally sat around like.
Oh, really?
From
It's
he started
rough.
it like a Friday afternoon, and he wasn't
It's
out of there
so
until
rough.
Saturday middle. Well, it's in middle of the night, but it was actually Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing.
Got to do what you got to do, and
Yeah.
you can't leave it stuck too long, or else you'll get some off flavors in a row. So.
Can you talk about those off flavors or aromas? Okay. Yeah. So if you do leave a stuck ferment out for too long, a lot of things can happen. But another bad thing, again, microbiology is insane. You can get other organisms taking over a fermentation that are going to give you flavors that are going to be just probably awful.
Different.
Unique different for sure. Unique
terroir.
for sure. You'll be your own unique snowflake among the barrels that you have or whatever you're fermenting in.
But it's a risk. It's a really big risk.
It's a huge risk. Yeah. So the winemaker loses control there if they are in a stuck ferment and they don't restart their fermentation. So I kind of wanted to recap a little bit what we've discussed today. So we talked about what fermentation even is, which is the process of going from sugar into alcohol. We talked a little bit about what types of vessels you can ferment in. You have stainless steel tanks, you have concrete, you can do amphora, and you have some kind of oak. And so that can be various sizes of oak.
And the classic plastic.
And plastic. Honestly, like, it's pretty common.
Yeah, no, it is very common, even though, like, a lot of people, if you go to an artisan small winemaker, they won't really mention it, but literally everyone uses it.
They probably ferment in vat, plastic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So those are common vessels that we can ferment in. The rate at which that fermentation goes is going to be anywhere from a couple bricks a day to potentially 4 bricks a day. And that rate might change as a function of your dog. That rate might change as a function of if you're fermenting red or white wines. We talked a little bit about the oxidative or reductive potential in wines. So we discussed how stainless steel is more reductive. You have concrete then on the going towards oxidative scale, amphora, and then oak treatment is the most oxidative. And we discussed a little bit about what it means to have an oxidative fermentation and the things that it could potentially introduce. If anybody wants to find information about you, Brian, where can they go look?
They can go to CaelestaVineyards.com. So
Yes.
CAELESTA vineyards.com.
Yes.
Quick Google will bring it up.
Yeah. That's the estate that we're on right now, which is it's beautiful. I wish I could take my computer out here, but I will lose the Wi-Fi.
Unfortunately,
It's gorgeous. And what's really neat about Caelesta right now is that they're doing a lot of plantings. And so me being like the curious little nerd that I am, I get to see all the different plantings that are going in and what really, really young vines look like. And we should have wine coming out of Caelesta Harvest 2019, probably.
Yes, probably. Well, pick to press for some rosé, some Chardonnay Viognier next year. Then play with the reds. So we have Rhones, Cab, Tempranillo.
Yeah. It should be
see how it is.
Super fun.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing an interview next week on the 21st with Ken Sweggles of Rises Viticulture. He is a viticulturist in the Santa Cruz Mountains who's doing just awesome work. He's such a great viticulturist. And we're going to be talking about the viticulture of organic farming. Viticulture meaning farming of vines or farming of grapes.
Which goes against all farming practical knowledge that they
exactly. So if you have any interest in farming in general, this will be a really fascinating episode to talk about. But for now, thanks for hanging out with us. And also the Nexus is really new to the science community. The Sci community in Instagram. And so let us know if this platform does or does not work in the comments. We're still really experimenting with it. But thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for listening to us. And I will see you next week on the 21st. And you will see Brian if you go look on Caelesta Wines or at brian.farrell.jr, right?
That is correct.
For Instagram. Yeah.
If you're in Paso Robles, California,
yeah,
I will gladly give you a tour.
Yeah. And Paso is awesome. I love Paso. But we have some Pinot to drink.
Yes.
And some salmon to make. So
that is true.
We'll see you guys later.